I'm Jana, I'm a 2L, I'm the MILSA president this year, and we'll be having a series of talks on Islamic law, and we'll invite some speakers to discuss family rights law within Islamic law and human rights law. And today we'll have Imam Mohamed AbuTaleb from the Islamic Association of Raleigh, and he'll be discussing sources and legal interpretation of Islamic law. And thanks for coming.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Greet you to the greeting of our Islamic tradition. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm running a couple minutes late. Chalk up half of it to navigating the campus, and the other half to a bad accident on 40, but I'm glad we get to spend this time together. I want to start with a confession before we enter the topic proper. I serve as the Imam for the Islamic Association of Raleigh, which any of you are welcome to visit anytime. It's one of about a dozen mosques and Islamic centers in the Triangle, not too far from here, about half hour. And I also worked as a physicist and engineer for a number of years. I had this dual background in seminary training and the natural sciences. But I'll tell you something my congregation doesn't know. I have a secret fascination with law. And as a graduate student at MIT, there are some jobs in the world where their approach is find the engineers and the techies and hide them in a closet before they scare somebody off. And I had been through my ropes in those kind of jobs, and I was thinking, I've had my fill of talking to metal. I would really like to interact with some human beings. Wonder what else I could do with this training. So I started, going to career fairs, going to career training, and an interesting possibility that really captured my fascination was to retap some of that childhood interest in the humanities, in writing and speaking, and in law, and to become a patent attorney. And I actually sat with several firms. I started studying for and did pretty well on the LSAT, even bought a course and started studying for the patent bar. Before I realized, there are only so many hats that one can wear in life. And I realized a great passion that I had was for serving the community, that I wanted to pursue further seminary training for. And I think it was only for that reason that I didn't end up pursuing law school. So I know enough to be dangerous, but not as much as all of you, but I just thought I'd share that story with you. And on that topic, when we discuss our issue today of an introduction to Islamic law, and I understand this is the first in a series of discussions and conversations that you'll be having on the topic, I must admit to you a frustration with how the topic is covered in many settings. I will give you one that I experienced at a prominent forum in the Washington, D.C. area where I grew up. And it was a forum with four prominent, panelists, some of the Muslim faith, some of other faith traditions, coming at different angles and discussing a very timely topic, which was some aspects of Sharia law or Islamic law in the moment. The conversation was vibrant, a lot of issues were discussed, but something struck me as missing. That throughout those whole 2 hours, not one of the panelists hazarded a definition or a specification of what is Sharia, which I found absolutely flabbergasting. I found it incredibly confusing, because really, as you sit and listen to those panelists, it's as if they were really discussing four disparate, different topics. And I started to question, quite honestly, with due respect to the panelists, whether they would be able to offer such a definition. Now, I'm not hiding to you where I come from. I'm trying to introduce to you a bit about how in Islamic orthodoxy and classical Islamic scholarship, the issue of the Sharia of Islamic law is approached. And I fully expect that in the context of your research, of your professional endeavors, that you will speak to people from other backgrounds and look at the issue from other angles. As well you should. But we have a principle in Islamic thought which says that the ability to judge on an issue is based on its conception first. Meaning that one that cannot conceive of an idea, one that cannot really articulate it and understand it, will never be able to appropriately judge with respect to it. Another saying among Muslim jurists is the issue at hand is not the terminology used, but the definitions behind those terms. And so key part, and you'll find in many classical seminaries and many studies of Islamic law in the Muslim majority world, that many units start at the outset with a definition of these terms. So we can establish what we're talking about, independent of the convictions and judgments and personal beliefs that people bring to the table afterwards. That's a different story altogether, but we must define what we are talking about. And in that regard, let me offer a definition of the Sharia that you may find in many classical Islamic books and among jurists. The Sharia is, in etymology, in the origin of the word in Arabic, comes from the root meaning way or path. And before the advent of Islam, many terms that have a technical definition in Islamic law have a pre-existing usage in Old Arabic. And this usage can be very useful to understand a term, because essentially they borrowed this term and gave it now a technical definition from its linguistic roots. So linguistically, the Sharia was used among the classical Arabs to indicate the path that the camels would take on their way to an oasis, on their way to a valued objective. And in that regard, the Sharia in Islamic law is the idea of God's law. It is the revealed, divine, godly way of life as viewed from the perspective of Muslims and many Muslim scholars. I say this purposefully, that it's the idea of God's law, because many of you will relate that when we talk about international law, when we talk about even American law, the manifestation of that law can vary wildly in certain jurisdictions, in certain locales, and yet we still retain the idea of this overall structure of law, right? And so even in American law, something as simple as a speed limit, or whether you can use a cell phone while driving, I'm not advocating for that, I'm just talking about the statute, right? And all of these details, and even much more serious matters, such as how you would deal with a minor who commits murder and what court they would be tried in. These trying issues do vary from state to state, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And yet we have an overall concept of American law or of international law, that these are all manifestations of. Well, similarly, the application of Sharia differs throughout the centuries, and even in our contemporary times or any snapshot in time, among different regions, among what we would call different jurisdictions, and in our times, in modern times, in different nations. And yet, the idea of this Sharia is very meaningful when looking at Islamic law. So there is a clear distinction between these two among Muslim scholars. There is another word in Arabic that is used for the human attempt to access this Sharia, and that is the term fiqh, F-I-Q-H, which is then the human attempt at accessing and articulating a particular conception of this divine law. So I think that Sharia is conceptually divine in origin for Muslims from a belief perspective, which you can appreciate even if one does not adopt those beliefs. It is unchanging. It is considered in Islamic law to be taken primarily from the revealed sources, from the Quran, which Muslims believe to be the word of God, and from the Sunnah, from the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and all the prophets, who gives the application of the Quran in words, in action, in actual issues that were litigated and disputed in his time. These two are the primary sources of Sharia. And so this fiqh is essentially a lens into the Sharia through the filter of the human intellect. But it has always been understood to not be divine. It is human, and therefore it is subject to error, and it is subject to change. This distinction is more than just an academic concept. It's very important because when Muslims practice their religion, or in lands that orient some or all of their legal systems around Islamic ethics or Islamic law, there must be a clear distinction between that which is seen in orthodoxy as revealed as unchanging versus that which is a human estimation or a human application of that which could be subject to error, could be subject to discussion and dispute. So conceptually, Islam as a religion does not only deal with what we would call ritual worship, right? Or prayer, or almsgiving, or Hajj pilgrimage, or fasting. It also contains within it a set of ethics and morals around which the adherents to the religion may seek to orient their life's issues. And to be honest, this is difficult to convey to an audience primarily that is familiar with, say, Christian and particularly Protestant theology, which has a rather different history with the interaction of the church and the state, and which equivalents of this beyond general morality are somewhat difficult to find. But for those of you familiar with Jewish law, there's a very strong analog, which is the halakha, H-A-L-A-K-H-A. Again, that's H-A-L-A-K-H-A. And this is the collective body of Jewish religious law derived from the written and the oral Torah. In this regard, many Jews, as with many Muslims, will voluntarily orient parts of their daily actions in terms of their transactions around ethical or moral norms from the religion. And let's contextualize this in an example. When we talk, for example, about marriage, there is clear American law that dictates the appropriate procedures to be given this status and this designation of being a married couple before American law. Obviously, its details vary from state to state, and I think most of you would agree that the main body of law here tends to come from the states, although there's some relevant federal law as well. A Muslim at our center, we will not perform a marriage unless the couple desiring to be married first goes to the courthouse in North Carolina and obtains a marriage license and meets those requirements, right? And think about a marriage license as essentially permission to marry. Now, that couple could then actually just execute, actually perform the ceremony in the courthouse in a non-religious manner. They could go to a Christian minister or a Jewish center or another faith center or just a general officiant from the general public who is appropriately recognizes that then executes that marriage, returns it to the government from which they can get a marriage certificate. A manifestation of the Sharia in this regard would be a person that comes to our center. We've got our requirements up there on the internet, you can look at them, but in order to get to our matrimonial services, they have to go to the county first, get the license, but then there are additional things. For example, in Islamic law, a marriage must be witnessed by at least two people. It's the same thing actually in North Carolina law. There's two witnesses in the Register of Deeds paperwork in North Carolina. In Islamic, moral standards, the family has a say in the marriage also. In other words, we seek for the support and the concurrence of the family in the marriage. They don't have veto authority, if you will, but we will voluntarily go through that process with a couple that wants to get married to help them either navigate the challenges that come from that or to have the families part and parcel of the ceremony. And so they may choose to abide by these additional moral and ethical norms that are not in contradiction with North Carolina law or American law, but this is not to be imposed on people, okay? Similarly, you may have seen some financial services companies that offer quote-unquote Sharia-compliant investment funds. Well, similarly, it's a free country, a person can invest in any fund that they want, but some Muslims choose in their investment practices to follow a certain number of ethics and norms that are outlined in the religion. For example, many Muslims try to shy away from interest-bearing transactions as much as possible. There are certain industries where many Muslims will choose not to invest as part of their individual moral practice. For example, industries that promote nudity or the consumption of alcohol. These are fully legal investments and fully legal activities under American law, but a Muslim might choose to orient their investments around different industries driven by that moral code. Now, there's 1.6 billion Muslims worldwide. There are 3.3 million American Muslims. And there are many people that invest in Sharia-compliant funds for purely financial reasons that are not Muslim in practice at all. So I'm not a spokesperson or representing the huge variety of interpretation and of application of this law, but I'm trying to give a taste about how the Sharia would be practiced in this regard by many Muslims. We have to be critical and forthcoming in this regard, and I encourage you not to take my word for it, but to inform your perspective with facts. When we talk about Sharia law, you might, if you surf enough Islamophobic websites, be convinced that there is a movement to Shariaize America. In other words, to impose the Sharia law upon Americans or upon the West. And I will discuss this from a number of angles, but one is appropriate at our station here. Many Americans draw their morals, their ethics from different sources. And part of the beauty of our country is that people have the opportunity to do that while being civically engaged, while being law-abiding citizens, without, at least in principle, even if our nation's journey is imperfect and always striving to be better, without judgment or persecution for where they draw those values. Obviously, it's a continuing journey, and there have been many minorities, and not just religious minorities, but ethnic minorities and women and so many others that have been subjected to persecution, as there has also been religious intolerance in the name of religion. And yet, a great founding principle in this country was that people would enjoy that freedom of religious expression. So we have to be fact-based in our examination of the quote-unquote Sharia law, right? And specifically, there seems to be, I would contend, for most people, just from simple ignorance and lack of exposure, a notion that the vast majority of those that follow the Sharia in America are somehow a threat or trying to impose this on others. Whereas the vast majority of American Muslims and of Muslims worldwide practice it in the way that the vast majority of Jewish people do. Practice it in the way that the vast majority of Christians do. Practice it in the way that those that do not believe in God draw their morals or ethics from some other source or from some place as well. And also in the way that it could be contended in our history that our founding fathers drew many of the general ethics and principles of this country from Judeo-Christian values in general. This has to be examined in detail and has to be examined in the light of sociology, politics, and history. Even you look as recently as the Supreme Court ruling on same-sex unions in the United States. Most Muslims worldwide practice a relatively conservative application of Abrahamic morality. And most Muslims, not all, you will see only have sexual intercourse and intimacy in the light of a contractual union of marriage. So many Muslims you will see may not have boyfriends and girlfriends in high school. Many Muslims will abstain from premarital or extramarital sexual relations. Some of those things may be a description of many Americans. Some of those things are a description of a minority of Americans. For example, I imagine most Americans probably have a boyfriend or girlfriend before getting married. However, there has to be a distinction between adhering to that as a practice and imposing that on people by force. And that's not to describe every Muslim, that's certainly not to legitimize those who I believe hijack the religion and do very much call for this. But again, looking at the statistics and looking at the majority of Muslims, we have to carefully examine the facts. And as I mentioned the Supreme Court ruling, and I'll challenge you to give me an example, I have yet to find a single Muslim group that lobbied or organized around opposing this ruling or changing this ruling after it occurred. Although, for most Muslims, this would be considered opposing to their morality. Most Muslims, as I said, will only practice intimacy under the institution of a contractual marriage between a man and a woman. And by the way, there are Christian organizations, for example, that very much did lobby with respect to this legislation and still abide by the law while professing, with that freedom of speech, their opinion. But I mention this dichotomy so we can be very aware of the facts. Sometimes, perhaps, and I would contend that at times, lack of literacy in Islamic law, along with, at times, incongruent media coverage, feeds this paranoia that is not well rooted in facts. There are definitely a number of bad apples who, most Muslims hate as vehemently, if not more, than most Americans. I will tell you, many of my colleague imams are on ISIS's death threat list by name, because combating their philosophy and really debunking their poison message from the point of Islamic law puts you in the line of fire. I have a talk on YouTube called Not in Our Name When Crime is Disguised as Islam, talking about the same verses that ISIS takes out of context and abuses and misrepresents, and challenging that. Not that this couldn't be challenged on so many other grounds, on humanitarian grounds, on having a brain grounds, on normal grounds, and yet one of these grounds is challenging them from within the religion. No, you are not representing Islamic law. And by the way, that's why you will not find a single scholarly body across the planet which ISIS attributes their perversion of Islamic law to. Charles Kurzman at UNC, and you have some professors that contribute the same, including Professor David Chancellor here at Duke and his team, look at the condemnation of ISIS and literally chronicle tens of thousands of clerics, of imams, of scholars, of politicians, of bodies that have come out opposing this perversion of Islamic law and taking a risk in doing so, quite honestly, being on those front lines ideologically and philosophically. And that's why the best that ISIS and their ilk can muster is a guy with a fancy-looking hat behind a camera on YouTube, because there is no real scholarly authority behind that perversion. There is no standing in academia, in the body of scholarship behind that perversion. So let's talk a little bit, and I want to be sure to leave plenty of time for your questions. But a person might ask, why? Why the Sharia? For Muslims. And the word Sharia comes in the Holy Quran, ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاكَ عَلَى شَرِيعَةٍ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ فَاتَّبِعْهَا. Then we placed you upon this Sharia. Remember, Sharia meaning a path, so follow it. So, for Muslims, and as I gave the analogy earlier to Judaism, following the Sharia is part of that manifestation of faith. Part of Sharia that is emphasized explicitly in the Quran is being good to your parents. And with my deepest love and respect, I say that's not always easy, right? Being patient when a conversation goes the wrong way, not being sharp-tongued. Taking care of our parents when it's inconvenient, when they're elderly, when there's that hard transition between always seeing them as a source of strength, it is part of the Sharia, and one is accountable for that before God. In fact, it is mentioned along with monotheism in the Holy Quran multiple times, ahead of many, many other things that you would think are higher priority. Prayer, giving to the poor of a share of what you have, obligatorily, not religiously obligatorily. I'm not saying the state comes after you, but looking at that, fasting, sacrificing, all of these things are considered part of the Sharia. Being concerned for one's neighbor, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, says that he is not from us the one who goes to sleep full while his neighbor is hungry. And so thinking of that collective conscience and being concerned and empathizing for others is part of the Sharia. What are you thinking? I thought Sharia is about cutting off hands and stoning people, right? And we'll come to that, by the way. I'll close with that. Is that penal law and criminal law part of Sharia? But let me draw your attention to the fact that you have probably never heard any of the above as being part of the Sharia, whereas they comprise 98 to 90% of the Sharia. And you measure that whatever way you look like. You can take a statistical examination of the number of verses of the Quran, about 6,000. You'll come to a couple percent. You can look at the hundreds of thousands of prophetic oral traditions, the hadith. You can look at your favorite compendium of Islamic law. For example, a 3-volume work, about 100 years old, called Fiqh al-Sunnah. Remember that term fiqh, what does that mean?
Human practice.
That human understanding of Sharia. You've got 1 volume about worship, prayer, giving alms, excuse me, fasting, pilgrimage, burials, bereavement, etc. Then you've got a whole volume, which will not surprise those of you that deal with law, a whole volume about relationships, marriage, divorce, child rearing, civil matters, essentially. And then a volume at the end which talks about everything from gift giving to other civil matters, and then about 1% to 2% talks about penal law, Islamic criminal law. So before we talk about that, let's say why. Again, from a worship perspective, this is considered part of Muslims' worship, this morality, this ethics. You could divide the Sharia into 3 pieces that are not equally sized. You think about part of the Sharia coming as what we would call in English spirituality. Notice I mentioned prayer, giving alms, fasting, pilgrimage. You could say almost half to 60% of the Sharia has to do with spirituality. There are whole books that talk about character, being honest, being upright, chivalry. All of these aspects are derived for Muslims from primary texts and give not only general guidance, but at times specific things that deal with financial transactions or marriage or responsibilities at the house and financial obligations. About 40%, just under 40% perhaps, could be considered what we call in English ethics. dealing with, again, the ethical way of going about marriage, avoiding extramarital or premarital sex, financial transactions, and so on and so forth. And then about 1 to 2% could be considered what is in Arabic called qanun, meaning law, which you could call penal law, or criminal law would be a good term in terms of how we conceive of law. So I want you to imagine how many people here have children. Okay. How many people have dealt with children sometime in the last 5 years? Okay. I would have actually had trouble answering that in MIT. I think we're in a bit of too much of a bubble, so I hope don't do that to yourselves. Don't disappear for 3 years of law school without dealing with children, right? They teach you a lot. But I want you to imagine, for this example, that I will play the role of a little girl sitting in the back seat, and you are the father or the mother driving, and we come to a red light. And let me ask you, Mom, Dad, why do you stop the car at the traffic light? What would you say? You imagine 3, 4, 5-year-old little girl. Why do you stop at the traffic light?
That's the law.
Because if we go through, we can endanger the other person.
Okay, so we've talked about a little bit about the wisdom of why. I want you to go down more basic. It's the first time I'm seeing a traffic light. Why would you tell a 2 or 3-year-old, why do you stop at a red light?
Police will stop me.
Okay, that's one light, one level up. Now go further down for me.
Red means stop.
Because the light is red, and red means stop. That could be the most, you see, I mean, that's not pre-programmed unless you guys are special and have access to something I missed as a child, right? But we learn that environmentally, right? The light is red, that's red. It's not green, it's not yellow. I'm going through that with my toddler son right now, and boy, let me tell you, it is harder than you think, getting red and yellow and green. I'm playing a game with him right now where he tries to help tell me whether to stop or go at a light, and I realize we need a lot more training before I let go of my independent check, because we got reds turning to yellows and greens meaning stop and all kinds of problems, right? So we have to learn what is the actions, what is the sign. Well, from Sharia, a lot of us, that's our first interaction. Why do you put your face on the floor to pray? Why do you dress that way? Why don't you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? We see the actions and the signs. And we could stop there. Many people don't stop there, they stop short of there. But today I want to push you further. You say why? And somebody mentioned, I believe you mentioned law. Somebody said if we go through, we stop by who?
Police.
The policeman, right? And so the policeman doesn't give us a ticket. Well, why would the policeman give you a ticket? Well, because going through a red light is dangerous. He wants to stop us from going there, right? And so after you see the actions and the signs, you can go to levels of why and go up and see some of the laws and the regulations that promote those actions, right? So when we talk about Sharia, there are also levels of why. There are those rules, those norms of conduct that are trying to promote an action that is seen for the greater good from a religious perspective. But if you go why? Why higher, right? Why again? You guys are giving me blank stares. You need to deal with more children. You know, like if a light doesn't go off, that's children's favorite question. Why? They always ask it 10 times more than you thought the point that they would stop at. So why? Why would the policeman do that? Why is crossing a red light dangerous? Yes.
Because if everyone did it, you would have a lot more accidents.
And so the accidents will hurt people, right? And so if everyone did it, then people would be hurt in accidents. Now I'm not at the level of law and regulation. I'm going to a higher level of why, which is that there's a mutual benefit and utility behind this law. You see what I'm saying? And so really one clear reason to stop at red lights is because if everybody did it, people would get hurt. Do you want to get hurt? No, I don't want to get hurt, right? But then, why don't I get to stop? Why don't I get to fly through red lights? And everybody else gets to stop, right? Why not just me? Why don't just I get to cut through red lights? You see, there's even a higher purpose, right? Beyond that mutual benefit and utility, right, and that people don't want to be hurt, you can also come to an overall principle and belief. And some legal systems might stop, we don't want people getting hurt, everybody stop at a red light. But it might be said that this is driving at a higher moral, which is that people are created equal. Just like you don't want to be hurt, you have to extend that same right to others. People don't want to be hurt by you. So you have to buy in. And there, again, from a faith perspective, that could speak to God's justice, that people were created equal, that no one has the right to use their dictatorship, to use their authority, to enforce law on others and not comply themselves, right? And so again, these levels of why, ultimately, if you follow them to the top, you might get to some overall principles or beliefs that talk about this law. There's a new, I shouldn't say there's a field of study related to Islamic law, which I'll just allude to here and cover more deeply if it comes up in your questions, called Maqasid al-Sharia, the intents and objectives of Islamic law. And they deal with precisely this, the levels of why in terms of a specific ruling. The common formulation of Maqasid al-Sharia in Islam are 5, that all Islamic regulations protect either deen or religion way of life, nafs or life, aql or intellect, ilm or nasl meaning lineage, and money or wealth, or wealth. So again, that's religion, life, intellect, lineage, and wealth. So now, when you look at different Islamic rulings, irrespective of whether you apply them individually, agree with them originally, you can start to ask these levels of why. So if I tell you, why don't Muslims drink alcohol? It is to preserve the intellect. You see, that would be one of the objectives behind it. If we ask why which is something that would be agreed on versus in virtually every legal system, why should people not kill? To preserve life, right? Why should people not steal? To preserve? And we could go deeper, and some of these would then start to be contended. You'd say, no, I think this is a better way to protect it, and so on. But similarly, these levels of why follow in Islamic law. So let me close with a couple statements about a controversial and modern, very, very appropriate for modern discourse part of Sharia, which is Qanun. Remember that we said that Sharia can be thought of in 3 ways. Spirituality, then what? Ethics and Qanun or law. And we talked about examples about being good to parents, being compliant in your investments and so on, as all being applications of that Sharia, even if it differs from individual jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There is a component of the Sharia that is in the Quran, that is in the Sunnah, that is a small part, which can be considered as penal law or criminal law. And actually the analogy to civil and criminal matters is not perfect, but it is close. It is a very helpful analogy. When we think about most law in America, right? Most cases are civil or criminal in nature. They're civil, right? Marriages, divorce, 2 parties who are, opposed in a particular litigation. Similarly, in the historical application of Sharia in Muslim majority lands that oriented their law around Islamic values, around Islamic application, the vast majority of things heard by the qadi or judge were civil matters. And particularly in a pre-modern context, these were appointed, the qadi or the judge was appointed by the ruler or the state or the governor and was meant to have independence from the legislative or from the ruling process. However, if you look at old British law, for example, if a person committed murder, then he committed 2 wrongs, not 1. There was a civil, what we would call a civil matter, which was due to the wrong that he had done to the other person, the deceased, and I should say the murdered and their family. And there may be financial compensation or other compensation. But there was another party that had been wronged in old British law. And who was that? Right? The state, or in old British law, the king, right? They had committed a crime against the king by, in fact, we have in our law, disturbing the peace, right? This actually, its origins are from that in committing a murder, you both aggress against the murdered party and aggress against the king by breaking the peace, or in our terms, disturbing the peace. So there is a number of matters which we would call criminal matters that Islamic law would be considered as crimes against God, essentially, because it's a religious law. And these are very few. There are about 5 that are agreed upon and a couple that are differed upon by different jurists. The examples are extreme, and the proof in some is almost insurmountably extreme. As an example, zina, which is adultery or fornication, put an asterisk by there because I'm going to define it, is considered one of the hudud, one of these criminal matters in Islamic law. But what do you need to prove it? You actually need to bring 4 witnesses, adult, sane, who saw without a shadow of a doubt the actual act of intercourse occurring. Which is almost, it's not even adultery at that point, right? It's something else altogether. But for that reason, in classical Islamic law, there are less than approximately 10 to 12 cases over a millennium and a half that were successfully brought to the judicial system. And the vast majority of those cases were confessions, right? Because it's almost impossible to prove. Keep in mind that so much of this was in a pre-modern context. And so, you remember those old westerns where there's like the sheriff of the town, right? There is no police force, there is no standing military. And so these very high penalty crimes that were almost correspondingly impossible to prove were rather common in pre-modern states. Again, you look at old British law or old French law, and you'll find penalties such as a penalty by death for stealing another person's cattle, or animals, right? Because it's almost impossible to prove, but these high penalties were meant to prevent people from these actions that were actually very difficult to enforce. There's several complicating matters that come in our times. First of all, there are over 50-some Muslim majority countries today, no 2 of which have the same legal system. So the study of a universal application of Sharia law is really a study of history. Today, many Muslim majority countries openly orient some of their law around French or British or European secular law, and it's clearly stated in the Constitution or in the law volumes of that land. But even in the application of this law, there is a lot of difference of opinion scholarly in how to apply these in a modern context. For example, to apply different penalties now that it is possible. Incarceration was almost impossible in a pre-modern context, right? And a lot of these challenges. And sadly, with colonization, with an overall weakening of Islamic scholarship, I think the Muslim majority world has been slower to contend with these issues of modernity than their European counterparts, who really contended with very similar issues in their own legal applications. I will also say with great regret that there are many lands where the rule of law is not applied. And that's a tragedy, whether it's done in the name of Islam, whether it's done in the name of religion, whether it's done in the name of a secular state wrongfully, where those core principles of the rule of law, of justice, are abandoned, and a woman is wrongfully persecuted for a crime that she never committed, or to hide the crime of another man, where spectacles are made of these punishments without due process, without just evidence, and so on and so forth. And for so many of us, those are the images that we conjure up when we think of Sharia law, sadly. And those should not be acceptable. Those should not be acceptable whether done in the name of Islam or in the name of anything else. But nonetheless, I hope and I challenge you in these forums in our continued conversations to look at the facts and to examine whether these people are truly applying these Islamic values and what we understand to be the Islamic law, or whether their abuse of it is nothing more than persecution and oppression in the name of a new excuse. And so with that, I want to close and thank you so much for this opportunity to join me today, and I'll open the floor to any questions on the topic.
I have a question just about, so I'm Jewish, and there's an extent to which there's sort of a discussion I've been seeing online about how I have a friend who's Christian, and I've tried to explain this to him, that we're not very concerned with the ideas of heaven and hell. We're very concerned with what you do on earth, and there's an extent to which your belief doesn't matter so much so long as you are following halakha. And like as long as the performative aspect actually begins to, in some cases, outweigh sort of the belief driving it. And there's actually a lot of jokes about that. Two rabbis are arguing and determine that they determine God doesn't exist, and they show up at synagogue the next day. Why are you here? Well, what does God have to do with it? Is this, and in Christianity, it's very different. Your belief very much is the driver of everything that you do. At least that's my understanding. How would you say belief plays into Sharia? Like, do your actions matter more? Does the motivation matter more?
Great question, and I think this is an area where you see really rich dialogue between the scholars of the three Abrahamic faiths. And I would say throughout the Quran, these two are linked and inseparably so. One of the most common phrases in the Quran is الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, those who believe and work righteous deeds. And so belief and a proper orientation of one's theology and what one believes is seen as material and important in the religion. And confirming that and affirming it through having actions that are compliant with that is seen as part of the manifestation of that belief and part of accountability before God. And one stands account in Islamic theology before God for all of their life's actions. Belief by itself does not lead to salvation, and good actions by themselves still makes a person accountable for their belief. And the Quran is actually very stinging in this regard. It's one of the most common phrases and very challenging concepts in the Quran about standing to account. And many verses about the Quran would talk about social justice violations of the Arabs. For example, they used to practice female infanticide and look down on women. And the Quran describes the Day of Judgment. On the day when the infant girl buried alive will be asked for what crime was she killed, right? And so that doesn't seem to have much of anything to do with belief. And yet the Quran actually talks about the compliance of action as part of that belief. Now I will say, I want to be very clear that not every sin in terms of Islamic theology is considered a crime. The vast majority are not. So not everything that the Sharia asks a person not to do leads to a state intervention in a state that is orienting their law around Islamic values. So the Quran asks for the belief of one God. It talks about why only one God is worthy of worship, but a person is not prosecutable or does not have a penalty on earth for not complying on that. Those are all seen as part of the accountability before God. Similarly, doing the right thing, when you steal from somebody or when you have a dishonest business transaction, then in classical Islamic law, you bring that before the state. In our times, you bring that before your jurisdiction, right? Because you've harmed another person. But there's a sin accounted for that too in our faith, but that sin is not prosecuted before people. That's a shortcoming that one is accountable for on the Day of Judgment. And God can forgive, and a person can seek forgiveness, but I would say those two are inextricably linked in Islamic theology, belief and working righteous deeds, manifesting that belief in action. Thanks for the question. Other questions or comments? Yes.
So one thing that we do in classes, and maybe this is a lawyer's problem, is we immediately throw out anything that people agree on. Like, you guys to like, oh, in this case, like the two parties, they agree on this. We literally don't discuss it. And it's kind of because all the interesting stuff happens at the points of disagreement. And so I'm just wondering, I actually love the outreach to try to find agreement across cultures, across religions. But what do you counsel a devout Muslim who is also trying to be a loyal citizen of the United States if they find divergent tenets of U.S. law or U.S. custom and Sharia? How do you counsel it?
In a practical sense, the Quran is significantly shorter than the Bible, for example, right? And a lot of these rules, again, an example of a specific one is avoiding interest-bearing transactions or something, but many of these are more general, what we call morals and ethics, right? And that people all practice, but may drive from different areas. What I found when we talk about divergent, what I really find is that some things may be culturally difficult. For example, a very common issue is high schoolers come and say, well, a lot of people have, boyfriends and girlfriends. How do I deal with this, right? That's not an area where Islamic teachings are fundamentally at odds with American law, but rather a cultural norm may be different from a person's own moral and ethical norms. In that regard, we provide non-binding advice. We talk about, we practice abstinence in our faith. We encourage you to do this, but it's a free country. If he doesn't want to do that, go do whatever they want. Similarly, many Muslims who are trying to have financially compliant transactions do struggle because of mutual funds pulling in from everything, finding Sharia compliant transactions. And so I would say that is the more common manifestation of when people just find that many things that Muslims practice and many things that Muslims are concerned with are very much like the